Hi, welcome back to LIS 570. So today we're going to be talking about literature reviews. I'm going to first try to situate what the purpose and the aim of doing a literature review is, and then we'll go over a couple of different approaches to conducting or executing a literature review. Before we get started though, it might help to say a little bit about what exactly a literature review is. So a literature review is the searching for, the finding, and the bringing together of a set of literature which corresponds to the topic that you're researching for the purpose of understanding what previously has been reported and how previously researchers have conducted research that is similar to yours in some way. Now that way may be methodological, it may be geographical, it may just even be about the population that you're studying. But the point is that we want to be informed by what others have done before us before we start to execute and do our own research. So as a part of the stage in which we're planning our research, a literature review is really consequential to the way that we'll conduct and the way that we'll design the rest of our research projects. So this is why it comes somewhat early in the quarter, and we'll talk about it in relation to the design of a research project. Okay, so if we know what a literature review is in a general sense, let's start to think about the purposes with which we conduct or we execute a literature review. So this can be really a variety of purposes. That is why we conduct a literature review. The first and the foremost is what I've already talked about. We want to surface the related studies that have already been done. And this will require us to bring together a set of coherent literature or a coherent set of studies to try to strengthen the arguments that we're going to advance and to really ground us in the research that's been conducted in a field previous to our research. The other way that we want to be able to use our literature review is to inform the design of our own research. That is, there's oftentimes instruments such as a survey or a questionnaire that's been produced by a researcher, which will be of consequence or importance to us in designing our own research instruments. So the more that we know about and the more that we can borrow from the work that others have done, the better that we can build upon and come to conclusions which either match or diverge from the previous body of literature. So we want to inform our research design, repurpose research questions, etc. But the last part is really the way in which a literature review becomes most formative and most important to a larger scale research project. And that is the discovery of gaps in the existing knowledge. So we tend to think about the corpus, or what we bring together as a collective set of studies, being or containing a certain amount of understanding and knowledge of the world. And when we recognize that that knowledge has a set of limitations, that is, it's not maybe been extended to a particular population or a particular topic, or maybe even a particular geographic area, we would say then that there's a gap in what we know and what we think that we should know. And so we can fill that gap by, of course, then designing new research projects. Now, I want to put a caveat here because it's really important. Just because someone hasn't done research in the past doesn't give sort of justification for why we should do new research, right? I don't think anyone has ever thrown a MacBook maybe across my apartment. And so empirically, we don't know what happens when you throw a MacBook across my apartment. But just because no one's ever done it doesn't mean that we should take that on. We know the properties physically of a MacBook. We know the length of my apartment, and we could probably guess that it's not going to turn out too well for me, right? So just because research hasn't been done and there's empirical questions that haven't been asked in the past doesn't necessarily justify them. And I say this as a caveat because oftentimes people argue that because something hasn't been done, it gives them license to do it anew. And that just simply isn't the case. But what is a great way of arguing for the relevance of research is to show how related populations or related topics have shed light on some new phenomena and the way in which your research might contribute to that body of knowledge. So it's a fine line, but it's one that I think is pretty particular and that you'll recognize as you come across it in reading other studies. Okay, so if we know now then what a literature review is and why we conduct one, well then what exactly does a literature review look like once we write it up and offer it out to the world? Well, what it looks like is a narrative, a section of a paper, and what it does for the reader of our paper or the consumer of our research is it first reviews what everyone else has done. So it helps inform our readers about exactly what else the research that we're doing sits amongst. But it also synthesizes and makes that existing literature more digestible for an audience in a single sitting. Right, so we have the ability to bring together a number of different studies and explain exactly what they found in a concise way and give our readers the distillation or the kind of just the findings that are relevant to our own study. And so in this way, we're really using the past to inform our readers in a kind of very helpful way, right? We're telling them what other people have done and what other people have found, and then we're going to tell them what we found. So this is one of the things that I think is a great contribution of a good literature review is it teaches you all about an existing field. Now, one of the most important roles, though, that a literature review plays is it helps advance your argument. So just like we talked about in the previous slide, just because someone hasn't done something doesn't make a good argument for why we should do something else. When we argue through the literature, what we can show is that, say, one person has found something and another person has found another thing. And maybe these two are in conflict, or maybe they're in perfect harmony and they completely agree. But either way, when we know about what the past has said about our topic, or maybe our geographic area, we have a better way to argue for the relevance of our own work. And in so doing, what we're saying to our audience is, this is the motivation for why my study is going to be relevant and be germane to the conversation that it's ultimately contributing to. So literature reviews, when we write them up, that is, we give them a narrative form. We bring together a set of studies, we describe their findings, and we put them into maybe 2 or 3 pages of written text. What they take the practical form as can vary just as much as the purposes or the reasons that we do a literature review. But I think there's probably just 3 practical forms that a literature review usually takes. So the first is really informal. That is, it's just kind of an exercise to understand what else is out there. And so we may execute some searches against the database. We may find some research papers, and we may write up just in kind of a notes that sits on our desktop what these studies are about. So this we typically don't make public and we don't share with anyone else. But a literature review that sits as a part of a paper oftentimes comes right after we introduce our problem and we introduce our research questions. When we do that in the course of building an argument in a paper, what we're doing is essentially saying, this is what I'm going to study, these are the questions that I'm going to ask, and now here's what other people asking similar questions or studying the same topic have also found. Once we do that, then we have a motivation for offering our own results in that context. So when a literature review is offered as a part of a paper, it sits in a particular structure of the paper that you can see here explained from abstract to conclusion. Okay, and one of the other somewhat confusing ways in library and information science in particular that a literature review can take a practical form is as a standalone publication in and of itself. That is, someone may publish just a literature review. So everything that I talk about in the abstract, introduction, background, in the previous point as a part of a paper gets erased and kind of thrown away. And a person says, what the contribution of my work is going to be the synthesis and the building of an argument about what this literature knows. So we can think about topically there being a literature review, which could make a really great contribution to a field. One of the examples that we've used all kind of semester has been about digital literacy. So imagine that someone goes out and does a comprehensive review of all of the findings from the last 5 years about digital literacy studies. that's going to be an immense contribution to our field, right? It's going to allow us to distill just what the practical findings are and allow us in one location to bring together all of those studies and see them compared with one another. Now, I want to be careful to say that just because a literature review stands alone in and of itself doesn't mean that it's not in some ways advancing an agenda. Because again, remember that it's the interpretation and it's the bringing together of a particular body of literature by one or maybe a few people. So there's going to be some subjectivity in both the way that the literature is brought together and the way that it's analyzed. In the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about what the types of analysis and the types of going out and searching for data for publications looks like in a literature review. Okay, so finally here I want to wrap up with a couple of types of literature gathering that happens when we're executing a review. So the first is what we call a convenience sample. And this is going to be the most subjective. So if we think about this on kind of a spectrum, we have convenience on one end and we have systematic on the other. So the informal end of our spectrum here is going to have convenience. And what a convenience sampling means when we're doing a literature review is that we're going to essentially go out and pick the things that we think fit best for our topic. That's going to require us to maybe identify some keywords such as digital literacy, such as digital skills, digital competency, execute those against a database, and then try to be somewhat careful about the way in which we build an argument around the date range or maybe the particular journals that we searched. This is most often the way that literature reviews are executed when they're part of a paper. That is, we're not going to be kind of systematic and completely formal and spend months doing a literature review. We're just going to go out and we're going to make sure to cover our bases so that we can build an argument about why our literature or why our particular study is of importance. Now, a systematic literature review, so if we think about our spectrum on the very formal end of a literature gathering process, is going to be the most formal because it's going to specifically say how it's going to search, where it's going to search, and importantly, it's going to set out some criteria about why a piece of literature is either included or excluded from the review. And so in the process of doing a systematic review, we're really kind of mimicking the research design process. That is, we're being really systematic and careful and documenting how it is we're finding literature, which acts as our data. And then we're saying how we're going to analyze that literature, which acts as our data analysis. And then we're going to report in a somewhat systematic way the findings of that analysis, which really mimics our write-up of our papers. So systematic literature reviews are most often the way in which a literature review becomes a standalone publication. It's used frequently as a technique in biomedical literature, in engineering, and oftentimes the natural sciences. But there are some really great examples of systematic reviews that are conducted in library and information science. So a literature review that is systematic in its gathering of sources has a particular protocol that's usually followed. In the next slide, we'll look at this together. But I think it's worth kind of understanding what this looks like. It's called a prism diagram. And what it sets out is a set of steps that need to be reported by the authors in each of the kind of ways in which they work through literature. So they're going to talk about which databases they searched. They're going to talk about how many records or how many pieces of literature were identified, and then move that all the way down through this workflow to the very bottom where it talks about the studies that are included. And at that point, then they'd start to report in a more narrative structure. I think systematic reviews are a lot of fun to read. I think they're very interesting to also conduct and do, but they're very time consuming. So they often take months, sometimes even years to get through. But it's a really nice contribution, I feel like, oftentimes to a field of research. Okay, so this is essentially the way in which or the reasons why we do a literature review. the way in which they're reported, and the way in which they're actually conducted or executed. This is, I think, nice background to the way that you'll approach the literature review assignment in this class. But there's a good deal of other kind of techniques and approaches that you can spin out and find or identify through literature review resources. If you're interested more generally in things like systematic literature reviews, you can of course get in touch with me. But let me recommend here, and I'll put these into our course book, some literature reviews that I really like and that I think are quite good. So I think ways in which we see these making contributions to our field can be found in the 3 that I mentioned here. So they're all conducted within the last 3 years, all have been peer-reviewed, and all I think are really great examples of the contributions that can be made by a standalone literature review.